Welcome back. We start a news bulletin from the US, which has recorded over 1,400 new fatalities from the new coronavirus, as some states say they are planning to lift stay-at-home orders. However, Iran saw a decline in the number of daily deaths, while Spain reported its lowest increase in the number of cases since 18th March. Globally, the virus has claimed more than 120,000 lives, as the number of infections tops 1.9 million. Details in this report.
Tumbling economies and socio-economic woes are forcing governments to consider lifting lockdowns despite the continued spread of the novel coronavirus. 10 states on the U.S. East and West Coasts are planning to lift their strict stay-at-home orders. But contradicting state governors and legal experts, President Donald Trump says it is his call to make.
The President of the United States calls the shots. If we weren't here for the states, you would have had a problem in this country like you've never seen before. We were here to back them up, and we've more than backed them up. We did a job that nobody ever thought was possible.
The World Health Organization says it will release strategic advice including 6 criteria for lifting restrictions on movement. Meanwhile, European countries are extending the lockdown, saying it has been extremely effective in decreasing the spread and deaths in the region. Britain's Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab too backed the approach.
As we're going through the peak of the crisis with the death toll at the level it's at and increasing, we're absolutely keen to make sure, absolutely determined to keep our eye on the ball and our focus on what will save lives, which is people staying at home and protecting the NHS in that way.
Elsewhere, China has approved early-stage tests for 2 experimental vaccines for the virus as the country battles to contain imported cases.
In Pakistan, Prime Minister Imran Khan has announced a 2-week extension to the partial lockdown across the country to stem the spread of the coronavirus. But he said curbs on the construction industry would be eased from today. Addressing the media in Islamabad, the Prime Minister urged people to continue adopting precautionary measures. He said the government is fully cognizant of its responsibilities in the wake of the coronavirus. There are over 5,800 confirmed COVID-19 cases in Pakistan, with 96 deaths and nearly 1,400 recoveries. Moving on to Indian-occupied Kashmir, where the Indian government has extended total clampdown under the pretext of coronavirus spread. The Indian forces have so far arrested over 50 Kashmiri civilians this month for allegedly violating curfew in the valley. In a notice, New Delhi said containment approach in the occupied territory includes 100% lockdown. It said the complete restriction on any movement across the valley will be imposed, imprisoning civilians in their homes. The curfew and internet ban have already made it extremely hard for Kashmiri doctors to fight the virus. The valley has been reeling under Indian curfew and communications blackout for the last 254 days. Meanwhile, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has condemned attacks on Muslims in India over COVID-19. The Indian media and government have been blaming Muslims for spreading the virus across the country. In a statement, the Commission criticized the continued scapegoating and attacks of Muslims in India due to false rumors. It said, these attacks are often accompanied by dangerous rhetoric by politicians. The religious freedom body said this stigmatization can breed further discrimination and violence in India. Meanwhile, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has announced to extend countrywide curfew until May 3rd. On March 21st, Modi imposed a sudden clampdown, plunging the country into panic, migrant crisis, and essentials shortage. In another news, the US and the Taliban have held another round of talks in Doha over the implementation of the peace deal and the delay in prisoner release. The Taliban say Mullah Baradar-led team, US envoy Zalmay Khalilzad and General Scott Miller discussed the violations of the deal. Spokesperson Sohail Shaheen said Qatar's foreign minister hosted the meeting to discuss the probable solutions to all the issues. Earlier, Khalilzad urged the Afghan government and the Taliban to accelerate efforts to meet targets specified in the deal. In a related development, NATO has called on the Taliban to cease attacks in Afghanistan to fully implement the Doha peace agreement with the US. In a press conference, Chief Jens Stoltenberg said a reduction in violence is the only way towards a peacefully negotiated solution. Talking to media before NATO's ministerial conference tomorrow, he said the security alliance has expanded its preventive measures to keep its troops safe. But he said the bloc's military activities continue from Afghanistan to Kosovo, although its training activities in Iraq have been reduced. Stoltenberg said NATO will assure the continuation of its operations and assisting allies in combating COVID-19. He said NATO is cooperating to airlift hundreds of tons of medical equipment, which was donated and delivered. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani says the U.S. sanctions against Tehran and Venezuela are unjust. Rouhani was speaking to Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro on the telephone. The Iranian president called for the two countries to cooperate together with the OPEC Plus group. He said America's illegal sanctions on both countries are against international regulations and human principles. Rouhani added there is a need to continue cooperation for reduction of oil production and the return of stability to the prices. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his rival Benny Gantz have been given 2 more days to reach a deal on a unity government. The extension was approved by President Reuven Rivlin minutes after Gantz's 4-week mandate to form a government expired. In a joint statement, Gantz's Blue and White Alliance and Netanyahu's Likud Party said significant progress has been made towards a deal. The statement said the two leaders held direct talks to finalize a deal for an emergency government. Without a deal, it will be up to the parliament to pick a candidate who would then have 14 days to form a government. Failure of forming a government will automatically trigger a snap election, which will be Israel's 4th in a year. Seoul says North Korea has launched multiple short-range cruise missiles into the sea between the Korean peninsula and Japan. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff claim Pyongyang fired surface-to-ship cruise missiles into the Japan Sea for 40 minutes. Joint Chiefs of Staff said the missiles flew about 150 kilometers in the drill involving several military aircrafts. The officials said South Korean and U.S. intelligence were analyzing the latest launch in a series of recent weapons tests. North Korea test-fired 9 short-range ballistic missiles and other weapons in March amid stalled nuclear talks with the U.S. Libya's UN-recognized Government of National Accord says it has seized control of 5 more cities from Khalifa Haftar's Eastern Army. A GNA spokesman said the government troops recaptured the cities of Al-Ijaliat and Al-Jamail, Raghalin, Al-Isa and Zeltin. The seizure comes after GNA gained control of Surman and Sabratha cities yesterday. The spokesman said the government troops are chasing out Haftar's Eastern Army from the area. The latest military gains allow the GNA to secure the road from the Tunisian border to Abu Ghraib southeast of Tripoli. Meanwhile, the head of the Presidential Council, Faiz al-Sarraj, has warned groups against supporting Haftar. He said they must opt out of the region or face fierce repercussions. Turkey says it will continue with its weekend curfews to stem the spread of the coronavirus. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said the next curfew will be on April 18th to 19th. He said Turkey will complete the construction of a new hospital for COVID-19 patients in Istanbul's Başakşehir by May 15th. Erdogan announced the establishment of 2 new hospitals with a total of 350 beds in Istanbul. The Turkish president ruled out any borrowing arrangement with IMF during the pandemic. The country has over 61,000 infection cases with nearly 1,300 deaths. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow may draw on the defense ministry's resources to tackle the coronavirus crisis if needed. Speaking at a meeting with senior officials, Russian President said the situation has been constantly changing due to the spread of the virus. He said the next few weeks will prove decisive in the battle to halt the contagion. Putin also said Russia might need to call in the army to help tackle the coronavirus crisis.
Ministry of Defense service members are working quite effectively abroad, helping our colleagues abroad fight this infection. They have considerable experience working in difficult conditions. It's necessary to use this experience, of course, but keep in mind that all the capabilities, including the capabilities of the Russian Ministry of Defense, if necessary, can be and should be deployed here.
The Southeast Asian leaders have agreed to launch a coordinated fight against COVID-19 pandemic. Leaders of ASEAN member countries made the pledge at virtual summit chaired by the Vietnamese Prime Minister Nguyen Xuan Phuc. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong termed the pandemic gravest public health crisis in 100 years. Loong said it's critical for ASEAN to mount a united response. He said none of the countries in ASEAN can be truly safe unless the entire region is safe due to region's high interconnectivity. The association's members also agreed to ensure regional supply chains remain open. To address urgent needs of member states during the pandemic, the ASEAN leaders have agreed to establish a joint fund and medical stockpile. The International Monetary Fund has approved immediate debt relief to 25 member countries under its Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. The list includes mostly struggling African countries with the exception of Yemen, Afghanistan, Nepal, and Haiti. In a statement, IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said the sixth-month relief will help the countries fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Georgieva said the Catastrophe Containment Fund currently has $500 million, which IMF plans to increase to $1.5 billion. Meanwhile, the World Bank said it sees huge willingness on part of official bilateral creditors to suspend debt payments by the poorest countries. The bank's managing director, Axel van Tossenberg, said G20 and G7 economies have supported its call for a temporary halt in debt payments. The International Monetary Fund has recognized Pakistan's response to tackling the spread of deadly coronavirus. In a statement, the IMF said both provincial and federal governments have taken several measures against the pandemic. The IMF said steps include quarantining over 3,000 from Iran, closing borders and schools, and lockdown in provinces. It said the government ended import duty on health equipment and launched a relief package worth 200 billion rupees. Meanwhile, Pakistan has thanked China for its financial, medical, and physical support in the fight against coronavirus. It said Beijing has provided nearly 530,000 N95 masks, over 33,000 protective suits, 10,000 testing kits, 36 ventilators, and 100 thermal scanners. We have a lot more coming up right after this short break, so stay tuned. Welcome back. Iraq says it has killed 23 ISIS militants in clashes in the northern Kirkuk province. The military says fierce clashes ensued after the troops found an ISIS hideout cave in the rural area. It said an Iraqi security member was killed and 4 others were wounded in the clashes. Earlier, Iraq's paramilitary Harshabi forces said they killed 7 ISIS fighters in the Kirkuk area of Kirkuk. The Iraqi military announced to resume operation against ISIS in late January after escalation in attacks. The US-led coalition has been working with the Iraqi military in the operations. 1 civilian has been killed and 5 others wounded after an explosive device went off in Syria's central Hama province. State media accused Turkey-backed rebels of planting the device in the area. It said dozens of people have been either killed or wounded by similar blasts in formerly rebel-held areas. Last week, Syria said the rebels have renewed their attacks on civilians in the northern countryside of Aleppo province. In Myanmar, officials and residents of Rakhine State have accused the military of killing 8 people in the firing. Myanmar army has rejected the allegations, saying it has no information on such an incident. The local authorities said the incident happened in the village of Kayok Seik in Pongyan township of the state. Witnesses say the army opened fire at the villagers over unknown reasons, killing 3 members of the same family. Myanmar's army is facing a hearing at the World Court over a 2017 massacre that led to an exodus of over 7.5 million Rohingya Muslims to neighboring Bangladesh. In the U.S., the death toll from storms and tornadoes that ravaged the southern states has risen to 30. Officials say as many as 60 tornadoes ripped through Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi, while severe storms hit parts of Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi have declared an emergency as residents struggle with stay-at-home orders caused by COVID-19. Authorities reported 11 deaths in Mississippi, 9 in South Carolina, and 8 in Georgia, while 2 people died in Tennessee. The National Weather Service says the storm punctured roofs, turned over mobile homes, and downed power lines. The storms have left over 1 million customers without electricity. In the U.S., a Navy sailor has died after contracting the coronavirus on the U.S. aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt. This comes after the carrier's captain was fired for raising alarm about his crew's vulnerability to the virus.
The deceased sailor, whose name is being withheld by the US government for now, is the first active service member to succumb to the COVID-19 pandemic. A statement from the US Navy said he had tested positive for the virus on 30th March. He was moved to intensive care on the 9th of April after being found unresponsive in his quarters. 12% of the Theodore Roosevelt's crew of 4,600 have tested positive for the virus. Last month, the aircraft carrier's former commander, Brett Crozier, had written a letter to the Navy asking for the Roosevelt to be evacuated and sanitized. This was eventually leaked to the public, leading to Crozier's firing and the resignation of Acting Navy Secretary Thomas Maudley. There has been a massive backlash in the US against the Navy's decision to remove Crozier from his post rather than heeding his warning.
Democratic Republic of Congo has recorded a 3rd new Ebola case after over 7 weeks without any new infection. The World Health Organization said a 7-year-old girl started showing symptoms after visiting the same healthcare center as the 2 previous cases. The WHO said the girl has a good chance of survival. The global health body said all 3 new cases visited the Horizon Healthcare Center in Beni. Congo was due to mark an end to the 2nd deadliest outbreak of the virus until a case emerged in Beni last week. The outbreak has killed more than 2,000 people since August 2018 in Congo, where militia violence hindered efforts to contain it. Ukraine says wildfire raging through forests around the defunct Chernobyl nuclear plant has been put out. Officials said hundreds of emergency workers used planes and helicopters to douse the flames. Authorities said radiation level remained within normal limits and additional protective measures were not required. But they said short-term spikes in cesium-137 particles were registered in the Kiev area to the south of the plant. Earlier, environmental activists warned the fire near the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster in 1986 posed a radiation risk. The fire began on April 3rd in the western part of the exclusion zone and spread to nearby forests. Antarctica is the only continent in the world that has not reported novel coronavirus cases, and Chile is working to keep it that way. Chile's Navy Commander Alejandro Venezuela Pena said scientific encampments across the continent remain under isolation within isolation. Pena said the end of tourist season on March the 3rd enabled them to contain the spread of virus in Antarctica. Director of Chile's Antarctic Institute, Marcelo Lepe Cartes, said outbreak on an Antarctic base would be devastating. Scientists have discovered most powerful supernova ever. Astronomers led by University of Birmingham and Harvard observed explosion for 2 years and recorded their findings in the peer-reviewed journal. Scientists said this type of a supernova is an extremely rare celestial event. They said it occurs only when stars with extremely large mass undergo violent pulsations before they die shaking off a giant gas shell. According to the study, this supernova was 10 times stronger and about 500 times brighter than a normal supernova. Huawei's Vice President Victor Zhang says it is focused on keeping Britain connected during COVID-19 pandemic. The assurance comes after multiple towers of the company were burned down over conspiracy regarding 5G causing COVID-19. In an open letter, Zhang said it is the biggest contribution Huawei can make to the UK's national effort against the pandemic. He said since COVID-19 hit Britain, data usage has soared by over 50% or more, placing significant pressure on telecom systems. Zhang said despite this, there has been groundless criticism about Huawei's involvement in Britain's 5G rollout. The UK has called such conspiracies linking 5G to coronavirus danger and nonsense, and asked social media platforms to do more to stop misinformation. E-commerce giant Amazon has announced it will hire 75,000 new employees. In a blog, the company said the move is aimed to meet escalating customer demand to fulfill orders for essential products. The firm has already hired over 100,000 new workers in the last 4 weeks. It said its decision to temporarily increase hourly pay of workers will now cost more than $500 million. Last month, Walmart also announced to hire over 150,000 hourly workers in the US, citing a jump in online shoppers due to the pandemic. European stock markets are trading mixed as investors look for an exit strategy amid coronavirus lockdowns. Regional stocks have failed to attract fresh rally as investors tread cautiously. Frankfurt's DAX is trading over 1% higher. London's FTSE 100 has lost over 0.5% as index heavyweight British American Tobacco slumped over 6%. CAC 40 in Paris is trading marginally higher. In Asia, Nikkei 225 led the gains, closing over 3% higher as SoftBank Group stocks recovered from an earlier drop to jump over 5%. Seoul's Kospi and Shanghai Composite gained over 1.5%. Experts say market uncertainty is the biggest challenge right now. Now let's look at the weather from around the globe. This is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.